So last week we were treated to an evening of reflections on Sangha, and 5 volunteers led by Bill Detmer guided and informed us about the inner workings of the Sangha. And then towards the end, if you weren't here, we were asked to write down what Sangha means to each of us. And the responses were then read out loud, one per person, all the way around the room. And what was astonishing was how deep and open-hearted they were. Bill and I were just talking about this. And they really do relate to the topic tonight, which is generosity. And I think for me, what really came through last week with the responses that were generated in our community was both the breadth of response, the inspiration, the commitment, and the web of connection that's possible with this practice. So tonight I want to reflect on the fundamental essence, that foundation that underlies what we witnessed last week, and that is really our guiding light. It permeates our intentions and our practice. And that's the concept of generosity. And as we all know, it's present in almost all societies, and it's a thread that weaves its way through nearly every spiritual tradition. And for Buddhism, it's the entry point, it's the portal, as well as being the essence of our practice. And the Buddha had this to say about generosity: if beings knew, as I know, the results of giving and sharing, they would not eat without having given, nor would the stain of selfishness overcome their minds. Even if it were their last bite, their last mouthful, they would not eat without having shared, if there was someone to receive their gift. So he's reflecting on the essence of life, eating food. And when he began teaching, he would often teach in sort of a graduated series of practices so that people could engage as they learned about the practice. And he always began with teaching about generosity. That was the starting point. A kind of a beautiful, inspirational practice, if you will. And it was one that everyone could relate to, the generosity within our own lives, wherever we're generous, and that which we receive from others. And after teaching, starting with generosity, he'd move on to the benefits of additional ethics training. So it might include things like the 5 precepts, non-harming, wise speech, etc. And then past ethics, he would begin to talk about practices of calming the mind, mindfulness, insight practices. But I think sometimes we forget that generosity is the starting point. It's the foundation. And so you might ask, well, why would you start with generosity? Why begin there? Well, for one thing, as I mentioned, it's easily understood, it's inspirational, and when we look at the essential needs of all human beings, we need safety, we need a sense of satisfaction, and we long for connection. And so the Buddha saw that by teaching generosity, that this was something that could contribute to those 3 basic needs of human beings. And generosity obviously can be the place for, and it interweaves with, mindfulness practice, self-understanding. We look more intricately at how we are, and for creating healthy relationships with those around us, which was critical 2,500 years ago and today. I read recently that even though we are more connected today than in any previous era of history, according to some, our greatest public health problem is isolation and loneliness. So what has come to count as connectedness is displacing the real thing. So how might generosity benefit our basic needs for safety, for satisfaction, and for connection? Well, we can start by taking a closer look at generosity and what the Buddha meant when he spoke about it 2,500 years ago. He used two words, actually, that are related, both Pali terms. One is chaga and one is dana. And the second may be a little bit more familiar to you. Chaga, which is spelled C-A-G-A, means not holding on to, or the abandonment of clinging. And that second word, dana, has two aspects really. One is the act of giving, and then the donation itself. Both of these words imply a relinquishment, a release of stinginess, of clinging or greed, and an act that entails, to some degree, letting go of some aspect of our self-interest, a giving of oneself, if you will. So letting go of self-interest. Ooh, can you kind of hear how that begins to test us a little bit? Because we see how self-protective we are, how we want what we want when we want it. We want our own way, or we want you to be like this, or life to be like that. We have ideas, expectations of how it ought to be. And the idea of letting go of some aspect of that self-interest can be challenging. Years ago, I was eating lunch at a nice restaurant with a good friend, and the waitress was grumpy and curt and sour and short with us. Not exactly what we expected. But I witnessed this friend respond with incredible empathy and kindness to this woman. She said something like, "What a hard job you have. Thank you for serving us today." And she left a huge, generous tip. I have not forgotten that. That act of really letting go of any expectation or self-interest in this simple little exchange. So gifts or acts of generosity, of real generosity, we remember them. We remember them. So generosity is a way to offer our attention to that which opens our sense doors. And to do this, we have to be aware of some things. We have to be aware of the negativity bias that runs in all of us. You know, the self-interest is really related to survival. We're taking care of ourselves to some degree. We need to have boundaries. We need to have ways in which we respond to that which comes to us. But at times it can become a biological imperative that keeps us hyper-vigilant. So we're looking both for prey, P-R-E-Y, and making certain that we're not becoming the prey of someone else. Our nervous systems of negativity bias are inherited, and they're conditioned culturally. And they're reinforced, at least in this culture, often with an attitude of, it's not enough. This isn't enough. There's a focus on what's missing, what else I need. One day, one of my granddaughters, David and I care for on a weekly basis, they were at our house, and the one noticed that the other one had just discovered a new toy in our house, a doll. And she immediately abandoned all the stuff she had just been playing with and was happily content with and said, "I need a doll. I need a doll now." I really need a doll. So, at 4 years of age, that sense of, oh my gosh, what's missing? What do I need? What else is here? Greed. It's there. It's there. We are wired and conditioned for greed at times. You remember this story, the old story of how the unpleasant is like Velcro. It sticks. We remember the unpleasant, and how the pleasant is more like Teflon. It just slides over past, long gone. So someone I know said recently, we know that Velcro not only sticks, it sticks around. So it lasts and lasts and lasts. So in some ways, the practice of generosity might begin with gratitude, with a sense of this is enough, of noticing like what's here instead of what's missing. And we see that we have a lot of expectations about how we think things ought to be, how it ought to be here, how it ought to be in our communities, with our friends, in our families, in the nation, in the world. We have ideas about how it ought to be. Generosity, again, a letting go of some aspect of self-interest means giving freely without expecting anything in return. So, in that sense, generosity is really more about how we are than what we do, which is a fairly radical idea given that we live in this society that is somewhat of a commercial economy. When we think about witnessing profound relinquishment, we can remember some famous examples. Nelson Mandela, who praises his jailers. Desmond Tutu speaking out about apartheid and forgiveness. And then to remember those personal examples as well when you've witnessed generosity. So, of course, the question arises then, well, then how can I tilt toward generosity in this life? How do I practice it? And so here are a few ideas, and there are many. The wonderful thing about generosity is once you start tilting towards it, it can build upon itself and you'll get new ideas about, well, what else would it mean to be generous right now in this moment towards myself and toward others, towards the world? And those of you who've been on retreats may have noticed, particularly the first retreat you ever went on, you may have noticed how non-harming was such a powerful part of the retreat. And I can remember the first time on retreat when I saw someone capture an insect using that clear plastic cup and the cardboard and carry it out. And wow, non-harming. I don't know if it was a mosquito though. I think it was an ant. So non-harming generosity involves stopping, pausing, seeing, noticing what's here. Sometimes it's a matter of coming home to the body, breathing deeply, and allowing. And sometimes it's just recognizing what's in the background of this body, mind. And for me, it's a tendency, the conditioned response of what's missing. So I just notice when that's up. And instead to reflect on what's here. What else is here? And then seeing what's here, maybe cultivating some gratitude for that and savoring that, not skimming over it, really savoring it. A Thich Nhat Hanh would say, this is a happy moment. That savoring of that which nourishes. It is this savoring or this lingering which allows the broader spectrum of the positive to stick and to become habit. And what we know is that habits can become states, and states can become traits. What would it mean to be generous in this moment to yourself? The Buddha understood that giving is a powerful source of virtue with long-term benefits. Whatever you do will have direct consequences on the state of your mind, your heart, your body. We know this now through modern studies. So what's really interesting about generosity is that the consequences of this practice can be appreciated in three different ways. One is in the anticipation of giving, of being generous in the moment, even if it's not long planned generosity, but just in the moment, if an idea occurs to you about a way in which to be generous in the next 2 seconds, that anticipation in the actual giving of the gift, whether it's a smile or a word or a noticing, a real noticing, a stopping to notice someone, and then in the recollection of what you've done. So there's delight in the thought that precedes the giving, the action itself, and in the memory of giving. This poem may offer you some guidelines about giving. It's called Clearing. Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world so worth of rescue. So how to give yourself to this world? Most of us think initially perhaps of being the giver, of sharing resources, of giving money or material possessions or providing sustainability for others. And a dana practice might extend that a bit further to include time that you give to educate or to mentor, to provide emotional safety, to voice support in causes for justice. So the gift of living by the precepts or with ethics, the gift of a smile or kindness, all of these create dignity. And we can offer this to people by how we relate to them, speak to them, how we are. And this practice of dana also means being a receiver, receiving each moment with patience and with a generous attitude. For example, when you're with other people, whether it's a dear friend or stranger, somebody you barely know, to give your full attention, to listen closely, is a real gift, particularly in this day of speed. And then to furthermore interpret their words, their actions, as with the waitress in the restaurant, with some understanding, some kindness, some receiving of that moment with some patience. And this means holding for each person's life's greatest possibility in this moment. We're all doing the best we can in this moment. Because what this does is to nourish and cultivate a sense of self-worth and well-being for ourselves and for the others. And it creates a safe space and connection, two of the basic human needs. We feel more alive and we feel more connected. Sylvia Boorstein says that the practice of dana develops the habit of sharing by experiencing the joy of not feeling needy, the possibility of the end of suffering. It's supported by realizing that life is inevitably challenging, and we can discover the relief of absence of self-centered preoccupation. Generosity manifests as contentment. So let's reflect on generosity for just a minute. Just sit back in your chair, make yourself comfortable. Closing the eyes if that feels okay. Relaxing the body. And recalling a time when you experienced generosity as the receiver, when you received generosity from someone you knew or a stranger. Where were you?